life.
Okay, well, hello. So this is something different. I hope that you all will enjoy this afternoon. So I'm Devin Kearns. I'm an associate professor of special education at the University of Connecticut. I have the privilege today of talking with you about how to help students read long words, polysyllabic words, as it says here, and I'll explain to you more about what I mean by that. So let me go ahead and start talking about these concepts. Just to tell you how this is going to work, I'm going to talk for about 15 minutes. You're welcome to put comments in the chat, ask questions, and so on. I'll be able to read those and can respond as I go or when I'm finished. So feel free to do that. So let's go ahead and start. So first I want to talk about why I'm here focusing on long words. And you can see here, I use the word polysyllabic to describe long words. That's the sort of Greek origin of poly, many, syllabic, syllables, many syllables. You can see how that works there. And so these are this is the reason we're talking about polysyllabic words. Polysyllabic words are words that contain more than one syllable. Syllables are actually sounds. This is the way you write the words polysyllabic with sounds. And they're defined by those sounds, like lab, and those have parts to them. There's an onset, a peak, and a coda. There's a rhyme unit. That's not important. What is important is that these words are defined by their sounds, not their letters, and that they always have a vowel in them. And I'm going to return to that point. These words are really important because children encounter a lot of them. You can see here, as children get older, they encounter more and more of these long words. By 7th grade, right here, you can see that students are encountering something 100,000 of those words in the text they read every year. So it's really critical they know these words. They're also really important for content area reading. Most content areas have these words in them. So for example, in biology, you might have a word like photosynthesis, constitution, you can't see that, photosynthesis, constitutional, maybe in history. You've got polynomial there and math. And you finally have aesthetic, maybe in some other area. So that's an example of why it's so important for students to learn to read these polysyllabic words. And they're tricky because the letters, especially the single letter vowels, like for example, the letter I makes a lot of different sounds. You can probably imagine the different sounds that the letter I makes. So for example, I can say the I sound like in hi here. Also, the I can say the I sound like in hit. And so that's already tricky because the I has two sounds. And it's actually worse than that. It can say the I sound, it can say the I sound, it can say an E sound, it can say a sound, it can say a sort of short sound. And sometimes, like in raisin, it doesn't really even say anything, raisin. And so you can see there that the I makes a lot of different sounds. It makes it very challenging for students to read these long words, but they're so frequent, we need to give strategies for doing it. And the strategies we use for short words don't always work as well as we like. So how do we help students do this? I'm going to talk about 5 different strategies that we can use to do this. And again, when I'm finished, you'll have an opportunity to ask as many questions as you like about this. So first thing I want to say is that even though I'm talking today about word reading, I want to emphasize the idea that it's okay to focus on meaning to some extent. That's not the entire focus of word reading instruction. For many students with dyslexia, with reading difficulty, many of the students that folks who may be watching this webinar care a great deal about, for those students, it's going to be really critical to focus on the connection between the letters and sounds, but along with that, sometimes meaning can be helpful. And let me explain what I mean by that. So one way to do this is teach students what's called mispronunciation correction. I'm going to describe what this means. What that means is if you were to give a student a task where you ask them to, and I'll read this to you, you ask them to shift the pronunciation of a sound. So for example, this says, this is Peter, a silly lion who can talk. Today we're going to play a word game with Peter. In this game, Peter tries to say a word, but he says it the wrong way. I want you to listen to what Peter says and tell me what he's trying to say. Okay, and so then the goal is, here's Peter. Peter is very, very cute, right? You can see there. And so we're going to listen to what Peter says and see if we can figure out what the actual word is. So listen.
Breakfast.
And you can tell there, Peter's actually me. This is my voice there, but breakfast, and you all know that that is, you can say it at home along with me, breakfast. And then here's another one. You maybe didn't catch that. Weather. Well, that's weather. And so that's a second one. You have to adjust the pronunciation. And finally,
shoulder,
which is, I'm hoping you're guessing, shoulder. And so what students need to be able to do is adjust their pronunciation. So frequently what happens with students is they will say a word incorrectly. And that happens very commonly when students are reading unfamiliar words, words that they've never seen before, but they probably know in their spoken vocabulary. What happens is that they say it, it's not quite right, it doesn't map onto a word that they've heard before. But then this thing happens where there's sort of this flip point that happens where they're actually able to flip and they realize, oh, this is the word that I mean. So that becomes really clear, much clearer to them what they're supposed to say. So if we teach students about mispronunciation correction, that can really support them in reading long words. There's actually research that suggests that this works. Researchers have done this. It's relatively new research, but I wanted to share it with you because I think it really is important. So Dyson and colleagues in 2017 did this. I'm going to share with you what it is that they did. If this is a little bit hard to read, I'm going to read it to you. And also, along with that, you can always, at the end of this, you can get a copy of the presentation. I'll share that with everyone. So here's what it says. So review the letters that don't always obey the letter laws. That was the language they used. Then you remind students of the word reading toolkit. And you can see here, here's the word reading toolkit. Involves saying the word aloud, deciding if you know the word, if you don't think of the word, sound like the word, choose a word that sounds most like the word you said, and then finally check, does the word you have make sense in context? And so those are the steps that they told students to figure out what the word says. And then students, in addition, would also separately practice with a puppet reading words that in context that were incorrect. And so it'd be, she pulled the door with her, and then showl, owl, der. What's the word? And the students would have to make that adjustment. So it's actual practice correcting mispronunciations. And then they actually had students read words with irregular spellings and underline them. And they would underline the parts that did not work correctly, and they would show how they made the adjustment. When I say don't work correctly, don't sort of follow the rules, so to speak. And then they would practice reading those words to show students how you could say it one way, and then you have to adjust it. And in that way, things that we think of maybe as sight words, because they're a little bit irregular, they don't follow the rules, they don't say the things we think they should, it doesn't become as important if students can say, oh, wait, I know a word like that. They can find it in what's called the lexicon, their mental dictionary of words. And then finally, they would learn the meanings of words that they were teaching. A second set of scholars who've done, and so they were then practice reading those words. A second set of scholars who did this were Savage and colleagues. So Savage and colleagues did it where they taught word recognition using typical word recognition strategies, letter sounds, and so on. And then they practiced blending words using the correction plan that they described this way. So you can see here, let me move out of the way. Blend the word with patterns you know. Ask, is this a word I know? Say letter teams that flip a different way, meaning they are ones that the students have learned, can have multiple pronunciations, like the I says I and I, for example. Blend the word again, and then again ask themselves if this is a word that they know. So that was the key mispronunciation correction activity. And along with that, then the students, similar to Dyson colleagues, the students would listen to words the teacher said incorrectly and correct them. So Simon says, touch your nose, ear, and shoulder, and the students would make the correction. You can see there how there's a link to meaning. But it's not that we're spending tons and tons of time elaborating on the meaning. And there's a lot of emphasis on letter sound instruction. You can see in both of these examples. But you can see here we're using meaning to help us as well. Okay, so then one thing I want to emphasize along with this is because meaning is important, that when you're teaching students to read long words, try to avoid words that are very unfamiliar to them, words that they will certainly not ever have heard before. And I want to give you an example that this is not always what happens, even in reading programs that you might have seen before. So here are some words from an actual reading program that shall remain nameless. But here are a bunch of words. So if you look at this list, I'll give you just a second to look at this, you may notice that some of these words are not words students will probably be very familiar with. So when I look at this list, even if I'm teaching older, struggling readers, let's say students in 5th or 6th grade, I look at these words and I'm not sure if they would know candid for certain. I'm not sure they would know rustic, maybe, but it's actually pretty unlikely. And then sublet, maybe in some places in a city or so on and so on, students might be familiar with that word, but many students would not. And then septic, maybe if they live in a rural area and they have a septic tank, they might know this. But there are a few words that our students are almost certainly unlikely to know. Hobnob is one. I don't think many students know about hobnobbing. I don't think they do a lot of hobnobbing. And so it's a very unfamiliar word. And then you probably picked out the word I did, which is pipkin, which seems like it's not a word at all. It actually is a word. I don't know if any of you have seen a pipkin before, but this is a pipkin. It's some sort of earthenware jar used in, cooking from the Middle Ages. We don't use it anymore. Nobody knows about that. And so it's not helpful to talk to students. It's not helpful to teach students to read words like pipkin because they're so unfamiliar. It is also, though, possible if you are using words that you think students will be less familiar with, but you want to include them, you can have students pronounce the words at the beginning of the lesson before you do the letter sound instruction. That way they've heard them before and will be able to make that link that I talked about. Another way to do this another way to support students with meaning is to read words in phrases. And this is a relatively uncommon strategy, one we used in a recent intervention that my colleagues and I designed. We found it to be effective, that we designed, you can see here, 2- and 3-word phrases that students could read. So for example, best supporting actor is useless too, and so on. They were phrases that are relatively high in frequency that students could practice reading. So this is not as common a strategy. But what it allows you to do is get a lot of practice using words in a little bit of context, not spending lots of time talking elaborately about the meaning, because it takes a lot of time to do. And a lot of students that we work with, particularly students with dyslexia, need a lot of work on words. But this meaning component can also help them. Second thing that can be really helpful to students is to teach a flexible division strategy. And this is going to be a little bit different than the syllable division some of you are familiar with, but this is, I think, an effective way to do it, and there are data suggesting that this can work well. So the first thing to do is to teach students, just like we talked about the I sound before, teach the sound of I and high and the sound of I and hit, and maybe even the sound of I and glorious, but you wouldn't probably teach the others. But teaching students alternative pronunciations for the vowels. When I say vowel, I mean the 5-letter vowels plus Y, because those occur in many, many words. They are the vowel anchors, and vowels often have these changes. So getting students to be flexible about knowing the different pronunciations is important. Teaching students at least the long sound and the short sound. Those are important. Long sound being the names of the letters, short sounds being teaching both of those pronunciations, and then for Y, teaching I and E and even I. Teaching students those pronunciations for Y is also useful. And so getting students prepared to read long words by knowing both of these is really important. Sometimes, depending on the way it's taught, people talk about these as being in open and closed syllables. I'm not going to talk about that very much today, but that's something that someone might ask about in the chat. The second piece, a part of it in this flexible division strategy, is to teach students a 2-part strategy. So first part is that every syllable has to look okay. This is actually called ishalab. Every syllable has at least one vowel, ishalab. I'll show you more about that in a bit here. And so the idea here is that because we talked about vowel letters, every syllable has to have at least one. So we can look at the word describe, and the word describe, you can see, we could break it into multiple parts. Well, if we break it this way to these 3 gray parts, it doesn't work, right? That is, you don't have a syllable in the middle part, in the STR part. That doesn't work. So what do? Well, we can divide it a different way. We can break it into D and scribe, and now there's a vowel in the first part, and there's a vowel in the second part. The vowel consonant makes it a little bit trickier, but at least in this case, that's a fine way to break in. So you have a syllable in each one, a vowel in each one of those syllables. So that's the first thing that students need to learn, is there's every syllable at least one vowel. The second thing that students need to learn is that, and so that works, every part has to look okay. And by this, I mean, when you divide it into parts, like describe again, the parts have to look acceptable. So for example, here, you can see that we broke the word describe, and you can see here that the DESCR, that's not an ending to a word that we know. So we don't use that with students, and so that one doesn't work. So we might need to try a different way. Well, we could do it with DESC, and then the ride part. Well, that sort of works because there are words like disc, right? which is not a word. We don't have compact discs very much anymore. And so maybe it works, but probably not. That's not a great way to divide. It doesn't look quite okay. And then we could do it here between the S and the C. That's more common. That might be okay. And when we're teaching students, it actually might be fine to do that. And then the last one, of course, would be, so it might be okay. And the last one, of course, then would be to do the D, E, and the scribe, which definitely makes sense. There's a question in the chat that says, what should we tell students about the different pronunciations of A, E, I, O, and A, E, I, O, U, and Y? So what to tell students is that these single letter vowels make two different sounds. And we need to learn both of those sounds. We teach them that A says A and A says A. And so we actually practice doing that. So we actually have activities where we have students practice reading the A with the A sound and practice reading A with the A sound. And that allows students to commit those to memory. And so we do that with all of the vowels to get students to learn those different pronunciations of the vowels. So that's what we can tell students about the different pronunciations. So one important thing that I'm talking about today is to be very simple in what we teach students about. We want to make the strategies as streamlined as we can. We want to take out as much extra stuff as we can. So teaching students there's more than one pronunciation and they have to be flexible. That idea and that they know their different pronunciations of vowels, that will help them when they read a variety of words. And they don't have to do, they don't necessarily have to know that it's open and closed syllables, although they might, that could be helpful. I can say more about that when we get to the end. I will save that piece for the end if people want to ask about it. But teaching students something really simple that like they have the different pronunciations and then practicing reading them in words, which I'll say more about, is really valuable. So that one actually does work. So then we can use that Pol-y-syl-lab principle, that every syllable has at least one vowel and the part where every syllable has to look okay. Then we can take a word and we can break it into parts. And so one way to break this into a part would be, and we sometimes call it a chopping card. We can break it into parts, we can chop it into parts here. And we can say here that we take the Li, we break it this way. And we know that the I says I. And so we can say lie, nen. And if you've taught students about open and closed syllables, an open syllable, the I is at the end. And so you say, oh, that says lie. Well, that doesn't quite work because now we have the word is linen, which isn't the correct word. So now we want to do it a different way. And so we can take it into break into lin, and then we know that's lin, and this is n, and we can read the word together. So we can practice doing this flexibly. A different way to do this actually would be to have the student look at the word this way and say either linen, but break it the same way, use the Li again, and ask students to say it with an I sound. It would be acceptable to do that too. You might not even have to divide it differently if you don't use open and closed syllables, again, which I'll talk more about. So there's a question in the chat from Tiffany. Hi, Tiffany, who I know well. She asked, do you know of free resources or other curricula that provide lists for mispronunciation correction to help kids improve their set for variability? When she says set for variability, she means the ability to sort of understand that there are these differences in pronunciation. I don't know of one. And so that's a key idea that it's a key idea for the future, I think. That's not something that is familiar to me. I think that it might not be necessary to actually have a list ahead of time. You could just find words that don't quite follow the rules, so to speak, and build them that way, build the list that way. But it can be a little bit tricky to do that as well. So I don't have a good resource for you. Maybe I'll try to make one for folks, but I don't have a good one for that. But I think it's a great question. Okay, so let me get to then, so let me go past the linen example. So the next thing then is to practice reading high frequency syllables. So there are certain syllables that occur in a lot of words. Here are some examples: lie, lin, and so on, tur, tie. And these are syllables that occur very frequently, and also ty can be t, students learn both. And these occur very frequently, and so we want students to be able to read them, and so we can actually practice reading these syllables quickly. What you see here is a list, and this list is from a paper that my colleague Victoria Whaley and I wrote, where we talked about the way you can break words into syllables. We talked about different syllable parts that you could use. That article is available to you. There's a preprint version of it that is available to you. You can get from after the webinar. I encourage you to read it because it has a list of these syllables in it that you could have students practice reading. And here's a description of some of these things from the paper. The fourth part is to teach morphology, and morphology is about the meaning units in words, right? And so morph meaning meaning, and ology meaning learning, and so morphology, learning about the meaning of words. There are data that suggest that this can be really helpful for students in reading long words, and so because students do pay attention to these words frequently. So, for example, we can see here that students might attend to the word in the word nature. They would actually find the word nature when they read the word natural. And we know that there's a difference in pronunciation here from the nay to the na, but there is a strong connection at the letter level, and it's helpful for students to learn about these connections. So I'll say more about these connections between letters and sounds, between how we teach morphology in a second. So one important thing is to have students practice reading affixes. So here is a list of affixes. There's one in the paper that I described. There are also other ones available online. Many of them are very good. I don't have a particular resource that I like. And you can practice reading those just with flashcards, just to get students familiar with them. It's not the only thing you want to do, but it's helpful to do this to get a lot of repetitive practice with these parts. There's a question in the chat that asks, why is it helpful to find prefixes and suffixes in words? And this is the reason. It's helpful to find them because it allows students to make the connection with this part in the pronunciation. Other advantages, these have meanings themselves. And so students can not only make the connection between the letters and the sound, but also the letters and the meaning. And so along with the reading of the affixes, it's also helpful to teach students about the meaning of those affixes. Along with that, there's a strategy that can be used called peeling off. And this is a strategy that was designed by Maureen Lovett and her colleagues. It's now part of a program they designed called Empower. I actually used with Haskins on a project that we're doing. And so I'm going to share with you the strategy that I think is really effective from that program. Their program is very strongly evidence-based with a long history of success. So we look at the word preview here, and the teacher can ask these questions. The teacher says, look at this word, I know this part. The teacher points the part, the PRE. And then so the teacher says, it says pre, say that part. And the student says pre. And then the teacher says, that's right, pre. I'm going to peel off this part at the beginning. And so students, the teacher, just like I did with the chopping card, they can do the same thing. You don't have to call it a chopping card. I just think that's kind of cute to do it. You can take off that part at the beginning, and then I can say, now let's look at what's left. The root is view. What is the root? The student says view, and the teacher then says, now I'll put the word back together. I'll add the beginning, pre, the word is preview. What's the word? And the student says preview. And so now we've given them practice like this. And you can do this with much longer words. They have multiple prefixes in them, and students can then extract the root information, the base word information. I'm not going to go into the difference between base words and roots, but that's another strategy you can use to help students with the peeling off and find the base word or root in the middle, and then once you peel off the affixes, and then reassemble the word. It's an effective strategy, as Lovett and colleagues found. So this is just a summary of that. I'm not going to read to you, but you can use that information. One other piece here is to teach students morphological word families. These are all different words that have natural in them. You don't need to teach all of them to students. In fact, that you might not teach many of them. Like I say, I have supernaturalism here. That's not a word that students necessarily need to know, but you can find words in the same morphological family and teach students about those words. There's an example of these words, a list of some of these words in the paper that I described to you. So teach these in groups and have students practice them. And it's okay, like with nature, if you have nature and natural and there's a shift in pronunciation, that's a good thing because students then get to associate them, and they also then at the same time are doing that mispronunciation correction. So it integrates those pieces of the puzzle. So I've kind of highlighted there lots of words that you wouldn't teach students. So here's an example in a program that my colleagues and I designed. How we've done this is we sort of had, for example, here you see the base word react, and then we found words like underreact, reactivity, reactive, reaction, and we asked students to practice reading those words. Underreact is not a super common word here. So you might say, well, why did you choose that one? We might not have chosen that one in a different circumstance. We wanted to practice reading all those base words. And sometimes when you design things, you don't always make perfect decisions. But in any case, we practice reading base words in groups. We found that that would be effective for students based on prior literature. And our program, it turned out that that was part of the program, and the program was effective. And the final thing I'll say before we go just to chat is to use resources that are available to you. The paper that I shared with you is one of these resources, and I encourage you to read it and take lots of information from it that you can, because there's lots of good stuff in there. And well, at least I think so. I hope you'll agree with that. And then the other thing I'd say is I have a website online where I've designed it. It's not focused specifically on long words, but it can give you lists of words that say the I sound or the I sound and so on, and that can be helpful when you're working with students. So that's just one example of something you can do. I also have lots of other tools on there for teachers. I don't have anything yet focused specifically on long words, but I'm working on that. You can find under the teachers section of my website, devinkearns.org. Devin has an I here, and it has an A in the second part in Kearns. And so you can go on my website to find other resources for teachers. There are high frequency word lists. There are lists of decodable words and so on. You can also take from that. Not all focused on long word reading, but you can hopefully find some useful resources there. And so that's all. So thank you. I hope that you learned something from spending some time with me. It's very strange, as you know, in a webinar. I'm standing here. I have no idea if any of you are paying attention, but I hope this is helpful. And so I leave the rest of the time here to give us a chance to for you to ask questions, put things in the chat, and I'll respond to them. If there aren't any, then I'll just say goodbye. But go ahead and ask questions, and I'll wait just a moment for this. It takes about 30 seconds for the questions to register, and so I'll just sort of wait for a moment. See if there are any questions. Okay. The question from Ben Powers: how early can you introduce morphology to students? It's a great question. The data seem to suggest you can do it earlier than we once thought. In first grade, especially, you should be teaching students about the ing and the s and the ed, what are called inflections. Those are very helpful to teach, and maybe a few of the more common prefixes, other prefixes and suffixes. But the data indicate when you look at texts for first grade students, the vast majority of words with multiple morphemes have inflections in them, have the past tense, ed, have ing, have the s, and so on. A lot of focus on that is really useful because those are in so many words. And with ed, there are multiple pronunciations that you want students to become flexible in reading. So important question here from Holly Lane. So hi, Holly. She says, what do you recommend about teaching 6-syllable types? So for those of you who are unfamiliar with this, there's a concept where you can say that there are different types of syllables. So for example, I already mentioned two. One is the HI says hi. That's called an open syllable. The vowel's at the end. It's sort of opened up. There's nothing after the vowel. And then you have when it's closed, the second kind is closed, HIT, the vowel's in the middle, it's closed off. It says the short sound, so the long and the short, the open and closed. There's also vowel consonant E, digraph, which means two letters together that say one thing. There's a consonant LE, there's an R-controlled syllable. And so the idea is that teaching students about all of those can be helpful to them when they're looking at long words and are having trouble breaking them into parts. So I've already told you what I think about the open and closed syllables. I'm not sure it's necessary to teach the ideas of open and closed syllables, but I do think it's important to teach students that there are open and closed, there are long and short vowel parts of the words, and so that is important to do. I'm not sure about the other thing. With regard to vowel consonant E and R-control vowels and digraphs, I'm not sure it's necessary to teach them as types of syllables. Those are units that students have already learned when they talked about reading shorter words. And so it should, in my view, if we use the principles I described, if every syllable has to have at least one vowel, and the idea the parts have to look okay. I'm sorry, my camera is kind of doing this thing, but it should be okay. The syllables have to, that every syllable has to have one vowel, and that it has to look okay. If we use those principles, it should be possible for students to read most words. The one thing I'd add is consonant LE is a tricky bit because we have at the end of words this pattern English where you have a consonant LE and the LE says the ol sound. And so I think it's useful to teach that. So those are the three things I would teach are the long and short vowels, which I already described to you. Maybe you use the terms open and close. I don't typically, but I think it's okay. And then the consonant-ly. So that's my thought on the syllable types. There's also the idea about syllable division. I'm not going to get into that. Has a kind of complex history. Another question is, what can we do when kids read the first syllable word and then guess at the rest? This seems like a difficult habit to correct. Yeah, so this is a difficult habit to correct. And you can imagine how the strategy I described to you, like, sort of, let's say the parts and then put it together, and maybe that reinforces that. So that mispronunciation correction strategy doesn't necessarily reinforce this. And the reason is that it's important to go through the whole word before you make a decision, because it could otherwise be multiple words. So you can emphasize that with students. One other thing I sometimes do is to actually use nonsense words. So nonsense words are a sort of controversial topic in word reading, because some people argue that you shouldn't use nonsense words because they aren't actually real words. And when you teach students using nonsense words, it's not helping them learn about the language. And that, in some ways, I agree because of what I talked about with meaning. But when students are what I like to call inveterate guessers, like they just won't stop guessing, what I really recommend is actually getting students to attend to the entire word by giving them words they cannot figure out the meaning of. They're actually words that don't have a meaning. They have to use their letter sound knowledge. That's one way to get students out of that habit. And other than that, it's, I think, a lot of correction and going back and doing it again and making clear to students that you have to get all the parts before you make a decision. We don't want to guess based on that. The flexible syllable division strategy and the focus on meaning, that's not about guessing. It's about using the information that we have about the word and then about the whole word, and then using that flexibly to make a decision about what the word is and correcting if it doesn't make sense. But you can't do that if you don't have all the parts. So I think just a lot of practice, repetition, and maybe using some nonsense words. I think those things are effective. Let's see. So just a couple thank yous. So you're welcome. So Lysandra, hi. Jody, hi. So Samantha, who else? Hi, Samantha. So she asked, where do the terms long and short vowel come from? Okay. So yeah. And she says it's confusing for students, and they and think this terms actually have to do with the length of the sound that we make. They're not wrong, actually. So this comes from this fact of linguistics that sort of like this idea of open and closed syllables. There are free syllables, which are the long vowel syllables that are at the end of and this is in spoken language, they're at the end of syllables. And they are actually extended. I'll say more about that in a second. And there are ones that are checked. Those are the single letter vowels in the middle of the word. So, the I says it in the middle of the word. That's a single letter vowel. And it's shortened because it's stuck in the middle of the word. So in fact, it is the case that the long vowels are longer. There's another reason the long vowels are longer. And this is always really fascinating to me. We think about the long vowels as one sound, but they're actually what are called diphthongs. Diphthongs are sounds like ow and oi, where we move our mouth in the middle of saying the sound. And people think, oh, well, that's ow and oi, and just confined to that with these diphthongs, we move our mouth. Not so. A, I, O, U, like I'm moving my mouth as I say those, which lengthens them as well. E is the only one that doesn't actually do that, but even E, we in fact say for a more extended period of time. So the words are not important, but the only reason that I teach them to students is because they're so common that it is useful for them to have this categorization principle. The long ones say the names, the other ones have these different sounds. And I will tell you also, I found that the short vowels are actually harder for students to get solid remembering than the long vowels. And I don't quite know why, but I do a lot of practice with short and long vowels. I found for some reason that the short O is the hardest one for students to get. In terms of articulation, the E and the it and the et are hard to distinguish for students, but the one that's hardest to remember for them is the short O, this ah sound. So that's the fact there. So students are in fact actually they actually are picking up on a fact about the language that the long vowels are in fact just a little bit longer. Would I teach students that linguistic fact? Absolutely not. We do not need to make first grade students with dyslexia necessarily into linguists who can tell you a great deal about the language. In some cases, for some students, especially older students who find reading very frustrating, that it can be sort of exciting for them to learn a little bit about the linguistic properties of the language. But for most students, it's not necessary and can distract from the focus on what's the letter, what's the sound connection. So that's a great question. That was a long answer to that question. Let's see. So let's see what I'm doing on time. I think we have a little time left, but I have no more questions in the chat, which is just fine. So I guess we can. I'll just wait for just one more little bit here for folks to ask a question if they want to. While people are thinking questions, I'll just add that please, if you find this useful, share it with folks on Twitter and all that, so that this can sort of go out into the world and help lots of teachers, especially in this era of COVID-19. People I know need a lot of resources, but there's a lot of stuff available online and they don't know what to choose. I think this can give you a base for that. I also want to note for you all the University of Florida Literacy Institute that Holly Lane, who asked the question, directs, that they have produced a wealth of resources that include lots of things like what I talked about today, their list of words and so on. I'd recommend going to that website to get some ideas. I would say that, so Holly, I'd recommend, if you don't mind, put a link to your website in the chat, and also maybe on Twitter, sort of link to this and mention the website. Because it's an amazing resource for teachers. For those of you who haven't seen them, the other two resources I strongly recommend are the Meadows Center for Preventing Educational Risk, the University of Texas, MCPER, but the Meadows Center, you can go to their website and get resources. They have videos also to help students. And then the Florida Center for Reading Research also has a number of lessons that are helpful. You can also go to the National Center for Intensive Intervention, NCII, intensiveintervention.org, and they have a set of literacy resources, and they have some lesson ideas there for you as well. So those are things that are free, they're evidence-based, and I think they can be helpful to you. One thing I've talked to teachers about is that it's actually overwhelming these days with the number of resources that are available. It's, everyone has done something like, a webinar. So like, I guess I'm guilty of that too. But I think that, what's really useful is to have research-based resources. And the ones I described to you are research-based. And so I encourage you to look at those ones. When we're done, I'll put links to those on my Twitter, so those of you who have Twitter can, well, I'll put it on Facebook too. Link to those resources. You can find some lessons there. So I guess there's not much else to say. What I will say, because it's Friday of Teacher Appreciation Week, is that this has been unprecedented. I read on Google that the word unprecedented has skyrocketed in its use online. And it's meant so many changes for you all who teach. All the teachers that are friends and colleagues of mine have said that it's really overwhelming to have made this very quick shift to online teaching. And it's scary in some ways because some students aren't coming to school at all. And other students are falling behind because particularly in beginning reading, that face-to-face time is so valuable. And people tell me you're spending 10, 12 hours working every day. And so I've been thinking a lot about you all, and I hope that you're doing okay. I hope that in some way, shape, or form, we can get kids back into schools in the fall to get them, especially the reading instruction. I'm sure, like you, really afraid of the consequences of this for beginning reading. Kindergarten, first grade, and second grade students need really focused instruction on beginning reading, and they're not getting it right now to a large extent, and that's really scary. I will say one of the last things is that I work with Fumiko Haft, who's also on Twitter. I'll share this. I shared it last night, but I'll share it again today. She has a website, Project Rescue, that is designed to provide schools with a free research-based tool called GraphoLearn. You can provide it to students for free. There's actually going to be a study where we actually do online testing with the students and their families in a secure way and with the help of the schools. And we're actually going to collect data on trying to see whether or not this GraphoLearn can prevent some of the potentially very scary, lack of growth in students as a result of the pandemic. So I'll just put in a plug for that. And I mentioned it last night on Twitter. I'll do it again today. So those are the things that I would. I just want to say thank you for those of you who teach, and many of us, other colleagues of mine who are researchers as well. We're all thinking of you, and we hope the best. And we're also working. Many of us are working hard to try to see if we can come up with new ways to help you in this era. I've been thinking a lot about how to help design new ideas, and so that's coming. But we're thinking about it. We care about you, and thank you for the great work that you do. Keep it up. And if you have questions about anything, email me, get me on Twitter. I'm happy to help. So thank you. And I think